Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Well, I thank God we're all here together, safe and in relatively good health. You know, it's very interesting, these thoughts here that I've prepared today. It has to do very much with kind of the state of affairs and how those state of affairs today in the Jewish community have developed historically. And a lot of that history can be seen in the scriptures and in extra biblical texts. But really at the heart of the schism that has taken place in the midst of the community and the Jewish community in regards to Jewish believers who believe in Yeshua today, but that's kind of the focus today within the Jewish community. Next time we'll talk more about quote-unquote the church and the break-off of the non-Jews and whatnot. But really at the heart of it lies expectations, likewise the concept of disappointment. Now, all of you at one time in your life have been somewhat disappointed. Isn't that true? You know, when does disappointment typically set in? I remember when I was a kid, it set in when I didn't get or hear what I was expecting to. Okay? How many times, your parents would ask, hey, what do you want for your birthday? And you have your list, and you share all these things, and you open up your gifts, and you didn't get the number one thing that you asked for, that one thing that you really, really wanted, And because you didn't receive it, you didn't receive that expectation, disappointment to a certain extent begins to set in. And you can see that biblically, you can see it historically and prophetically in the schism that took place between the Jewish community, between the traditional Jewish community and those who were part of the way, those who were part of the Yeshua movement at the time in the early centuries, in the early first century. Exodus 4:1, we begin to see a little bit of a shadow of this disappointment, this expectation. It begins actually with Moses. What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? Moses says to the Lord on the mountain. You remember, he took his shoes off, he was on holy ground. He's in front of the burning bush. The Lord declares to him who, Moses says, what name shall I declare? He says, I am that I am. And Moses, he continues in this banter, with Adonai. He says, well, okay, that's wonderful, but what if the people don't believe me? Okay? What if they're disappointed in me? What if I'm not what they expected? Moshe is of the mind that the people will be disappointed in him and as a result be unwilling to see him as their ordained deliverer. He has hesitation, and as the argument goes along in Exodus 4, the Lord grows more and more impatient. It says that actually the Lord flared up with anger. And he says, don't worry, your brother will be your mouthpiece, okay? I've got everything taken care of. They will see the signs, and they will adhere to those signs, but the Lord never promised, he never said that there weren't going to be any hairy situations, any situations where disbelief wouldn't set in. So you can see the hesitation, this disappointment in Moses, because he doesn't know if he will be what the people expect. Exodus 6:9, so Moses reported this to the children of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their impatience and their cruel bondage. So fast forward here for a time, and because of Moses and Aharon in the presence of Pharaoh, Pharaoh didn't like what he heard. So what did he do? He increased the workload of the children of Israel. And Moses tried to comfort them with the words of the Lord, but they didn't hear him. They were disappointed because the deliverance that was expected didn't happen at that very moment in the way that they saw it. So it says they grew impatient, and as a result of their impatience and their cruel bondage, what is interesting is most English translations don't render the word ruach, which is actually in the text here. I've only found one, and that's in the Hebrew Tanakh. And it says that they had an impatient, a short spirit about them, which I think alters the text a little bit. It's a very interesting thing. It says here that on their account of their patience and their cruel bondage. So there was two things that prevented them from believing in Moses as a deliverer, at least for a brief moment. Disappointment set in, and because of what took place as a result of Moses and Aaron's involvement, now Pharaoh comes down on them that much harder. And so they grew short in their spirit, and as a result of their cruel bondage. Okay? Now this is a precursor and a shadow of things that are yet to come in the first century when Yeshua walked the earth and was gathering disciples amongst himself. At the heart of the matter, which saw the eventual separation of the first century believing Jews from the mainstream traditional Jewish community that didn't see Yeshua as the Messiah, was this whole idea of Messianism, of great Messianic expectation. This is what ruled the day. Now don't mistake Messianism for an established entity or expression such as what we see today. We understand Messianism, Messianic Judaism, as a movement, as an established entity, okay, as a practice. Messianism in the first century, what we would consider a Messianic understanding, was a deep-seated expectation that it was inoculated into individuals from their very youth to expect a deliverer. This time, we have the Romans on the scene rather than the Egyptians, okay? But the expectations are the same. If you were a Jew living in the region at the time, more than likely, from your very youth, it was pushed into your mind, into your psyche, into your mentality, as you woke up in the morning and as your breath was returned to you by a holy God, you knew that a deliverer was on his way. You knew someone was coming very, very soon to take you away and to deal with this oppression, to dispel this oppression. A coming king would come and deliver you from the oppression of Roman bondage. As the years came and went, expectations shifted and transformed, especially in regards to the identity of the deliverer and how he would present himself. Was he to be a servant? Was he to be a king? Was he to be a politician, a political figure? Very interesting, because many of those same arguments take place today in modern-day Israel. Yeah. As one historian puts it, the features of this national political expectation are the recovery of independence and power. Speaking of the first century, okay? Their expectations shifted, and as did the perceived role, mind you, perceived role of the Messiah King figure. By the time of the first century, the common focus, though still derived from biblical prophecy, was mainly national. It was mainly political. Okay? Very much what happened during the time of the Maccabees. They knew that God would arise, but they believed that he would use an individual to deliver them from the oppression of their servitude and their slavery. There was great fixation on texts such as Jeremiah 23, as Jews throughout the land looked eagerly toward a coming golden age. Now this was no ordinary golden age. They believed in the coming again, the rebirth of the Davidic kingdom. Okay, because this is what they had as a reference point. The height of the kingdom of Israel was during the time of David and Solomon. Really, during the reign of Solomon was the height of it, as far as the amount of land, the amount of riches, the amount of wisdom. So the children of Israel during the days of Yeshua yearned for the going back. They yearned for the good old days, so to speak. Okay? And even Yeshua's disciples were not immune to this understanding. In fact, what you see historically, culturally, when you do the research, that Yeshua's disciples believed the very same way that the rest of the nation of Israel did. They had the same expectations. And they go back to Jeremiah 23. Behold, the days are coming, declares Adonai, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. And he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is his name by which he will be called Adonai Tzidkenu, which is Adonai, our righteousness. And you can see this messianic expectation is the very same in the Yeshua movement of the way of the time as it was together with the nation of Israel. They all believed in the same thing. When they were together, they asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore self-rule to Israel? Very interesting, isn't it? He answered, you don't need to know the dates of the times. The Father has kept these under his own authority. So as history bears out, at least as far as thought and observance are concerned, there was very little that separated the early believing Jewish community. Believing mean they all believed, okay? When I say believing, I mean those who believed in Yeshua as the Messiah, as the promised Messiah. the separation between them and the rest of the community around them. It didn't have as much to do with thought and observance because, as you can see, everyone desired a restoration of self-rule. They all desired to see the manifestation of the Davidic and the Solomon era. The Romans considered Jewish believers in Yeshua as simply another sect within the Jewish faith, which is very interesting. The believers continued in their zealous observance of Torah, which we read in extra-biblical texts as well as in the Scriptures, especially in the book of Acts. They continued in their zealous observances, the traditional prayers, temple worship, sacrifices, and even tzedakah, which is deeds of charity, deeds of righteousness for the poor. Yet they boldly defended and proclaimed the name of Yeshua of Nazareth as the promised Mashiach, as the promised Messiah, the anointed one, according to the Scriptures. They saw Jeremiah 23 fulfilled in Yeshua. But interestingly, they still thought along the same lines as the rest of the nation as far as the preeminence of this kingdom and when it's going to happen. We want to see it now, because if Messiah is here, naturally his kingdom will follow. Okay? At this time, are you going to restore self-rule? Now notice one thing that you don't see here. You don't see a, hey guys, relax, because that's never going to happen. That's a fantasy. He never says that. Okay? Implicit in the text is that one day self-rule will return to Israel, but it's not up to you to know exactly when that's going to happen. But I will fulfill Jeremiah 23, I am fulfilling it, and the remainder of it will be fulfilled one day when I return. And over time, his disciples understood that. But implicit within the text is the reality that self-rule will return again. So you don't have to worry about those things. It's all in God's timing. So given the Messianic fervor of the day, why do you suppose this caused so much trouble in the midst of the Jewish community? If they thought along the same lines, if they observed the same things, where does this commotion begin and why? Of course, besides the spiritual implication, because there were differences as far as who Yeshua is and who the Messiah was to be. Everyone had come to believe the Mashiach is coming to deliver, and to deliver now. To dispel occupation now. That he would come and set up the golden age, which was, again, the kingdom of God. But here's the problem. The Romans were still here. Yeshua died. Many did not acknowledge that he rose from the dead. In fact, if you remember what happened amongst some of the religious leadership, they began to spread lies that Yeshua's disciples stole the body. Okay? So the very concept, the very idea of Messiah, at least in Yeshua, for the mainstream Jewish community it wasn't possible. Not only did he die, but his disciples were creating a fantasy now. And this was propagated throughout the community. And of course the Romans were still here, so Yeshua couldn't have been the Messiah. Okay? As a result of all this, many saw Yeshua as a false Messiah, and one whose followers were slowly beginning to cause disturbances within the community. Oftentimes through the performing of miracles, interestingly. It was oftentimes during the taking place of miracles that some of the greatest ruckuses were created, and oftentimes they were brought before the Sanhedrin for helping people, of all things. Okay? It was the growing reputation of, quote-unquote, the way and its followers that began to be viewed as a threat to the establishment. And what better way to malign a group of Jews at that time than to proclaim that they were indeed threatening the establishment, because there was a time and a season in Israel's history where they feared the crumbling and the decimation of what was considered the establishment. And we first see this with Stephen, if you remember. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs, hence the miracles again, among the people. But some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen, but they were unable to cope with the wisdom and spirit with which he was speaking. Then they secretly induced men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moshe and against God." And they put forward false witnesses who said this man incessantly speaks against the holy place, one, and against the Torah. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene Yeshua will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down. Very interesting pattern, isn't it? They desired above all else to maintain the status quo, and that was the establishment at the time. And they used this argument, interestingly, even falsely, because they knew how important it was to maintain the temple and to maintain Moshe's customs. Now, who else was accused of a very similar thing? Remember Yeshua? Some stood and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We have heard him say, I will destroy this temple with his hands. And in 3 days I will build another made without hands." Of course, we know what Yeshua was referring to, but what I'm trying to show you here is the preeminent place of the establishment, i.e. the temple of the time. And the main arguments used against the early community had very much to do with the maintenance of the temple. The argument was, hey, these guys need to be put in their place because they're coming to threaten not only the temple, but all that Moses has handed down to us. In both cases, the charges were false, but the outcome made one thing clear, that the Notzrim, or the Nazarenes, were to be taken very, very seriously by the Temple Sanhedrin, and over time, they became the subject of further harassment and arrest. So why the constant charges pertaining to the protection of the establishment, and how does this play into the persecution of the early believing community and its leaders? While this is no small subject, history shows us a very interesting trend that shouldn't be overlooked. While the believing community most certainly would meet in various synagogues, what were they considered overall, especially in the beginning of the book of Acts? Where would they meet? They would meet on the steps of the temple. In fact, they were considered a temple sect for the most part, although they would go to the synagogues along with other Jews. But in its infancy, the Messianic Jewish movement, whatever term you want to use, they were a temple sect. Okay, so it was very easy for leaders in power at the time to use this against them, because they did feel honestly that there were many threats and ruckuses created by this temple sect, by this infant temple movement. They were primarily a temple sect and were known as such. This placed them as a thorn in the sides of the heads of the temple establishment. So let's look at the temple leadership in place when 3 of the major persecutions, in fact 3 real persecutions, took place of the early community. Against the early community by some of the leaders. So we see here the common denominator in these 3. Let's begin with the first. Stephen is stoned to death. This begins the first official persecution of the early community. Of course, we know that Rabbi Paul, Shaul, sort of spearheaded that, and that went for a season, and that persecution eventually fizzled out, although there was still much hatred for the community. The reigning high priest, Caiaphas, again, the party Sadducean. Caiaphas also presided over Yeshua's trial and condemnation. In 42 CE, Acts chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, was instigated by Herod Agrippa I, who had Yaakov ben Zabdi put to death, James the son of Zebedee. Reigning high priest, again, of the Sadducean party, Matthias ben Hananiah, or Matityahu. And fast forward 20 years, 62, Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, is killed. And of course, he was the head of the Jerusalem community. And Hananiah II, again, reigning high priest, party, affiliation, Sadducean. Now, what do you see as the common denominator as far as the early persecution of this temple sect?
Sadducees.
It was the Sadducean parties, of course, who was responsible for the welfare of the temple establishment at the time. Of course, it was the Sanhedrin, but the bulk of the Sanhedrin was made up of Sadducees. Okay? So oftentimes people go, oh, those terrible Pharisees, those bad Pharisees, they were the ones responsible. It was all their bad teachings and all this and that. Well, that's not the case. Okay? History shows us quite differently, especially in the early movement, that the bulk of the charges, the bulk of the problems, the bulk of the persecution had very much to do with the very small sect of the Sadducean party, which made up, 80 to 90% of the Sanhedrin, or the ruling party. Is it a coincidence that similar trumped-up charges pertaining to the temple were laid out in both the cases of Yeshua and Stephen? So what's the main issue? Of course, the temple. But not just the temple, but the livelihood of the now corrupt Sanhedrin. Because when you do the history, you realize that this wasn't a Sanhedrin connected to the proper line, the proper priestly line. It was a Sanhedrin that had been placed as a result of their unity with Rome. Rome was very much connected with all of these things, and really it was the job of the Sanhedrin, and very much so the Sadducees, to maintain a peace, lest the Romans come in and destroy the establishment. The Romans were working very closely with the Sadducean, hence also the Sanhedrin party. Why was the way, which was again a temple sect in its infancy, deemed such a threat by the authorities? Well, really we have several reasons. It's important to understand that while they were a minority ruling group, the Sadducees held the highest positions of influence in the Sanhedrin and were really considered a priestly aristocracy, mainly due to their relationship again with Rome. This relationship made them popular or unpopular with the people? Very unpopular. Okay? It was really the Pharisaic teachings that really resonated with the people. The purity for the common man, although there was also issues with the way in which the Pushim, the Pharisees, saw the Ha'aretz, the people of the land, but for the most part, the common individuals adhered much more to Pharisaic teaching than they did to Sadducean teaching. Okay? And given their relationship with Rome, they were frowned upon by people. So let's look at some of the underlying issues that the people would have had with the fledgling Messianic community, or at least not the people, but the Sadducean party. Four of the main disputes that led to some of the charges, the threats that were seen by the Sadducean party against why they would consider the early believing community threats. Yeshua's disciples held to a high standard of holiness. Now we see in Josephus that the Sadducees deny fate entirely and suppose that God is not concerned in our doing or not doing evil. And they say that to act what is good or what is evil is at man's own choice, and that the one or the other belongs to everyone, and that they may act as they please. Now, this went very much against Pharisaic understanding of the time, okay, where the the Pharisees really harped on ritual purity for the everyman, okay, and it was the calling of God's people, the children of Israel, to walk holy in His sight, to walk in holiness and in purity. The Sadducees didn't see it in that same way. And of course, Yeshua's disciples walking in holiness and in purity would have had serious issue with this as well, in which one of the reasons why they were deemed such a threat by the Sadducean or the Sanhedrin of the time.
Yeah, just one thing. When the Sadducees are saying that you can act evil or non-evil or do what you want either which way, that is true. But they believe that without consequence. Is that the point?
Because they didn't believe in an afterlife
right.
as well, or a resurrection.
Right. That was
yes,
the point.
Exactly. Yeshua's disciples believed and promoted the resurrection of the dead. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is that souls die with the bodies. As for the persistence of the soul after death, penalties in the underworld and rewards, they will have none of them. Further, in Acts chapter 23, verse 8, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three.
Sorry, you were just here with that.
Yeah, that's okay. A third dispute, Yeshua's disciples proclaimed a Messiah who was king. Now that didn't sit well with the Romans. Neither the Roman leaders nor the Jewish leaders wanted people proclaiming to be the Messiah for fear of riots and uprisings that would cause a threat. It was left up to them to quell any subversive behavior which was deemed threatening to the peace. Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. They plotted together that they might seize Yeshua by stealth and kill him, but not during the festival. They were saying so that there won't be a riot amongst the people. And so now you can begin to see how some of the extra-biblical texts line up with the thought and practice and the narrative of the Scriptures. And the fourth, all Messianic claims endangered the temple, and thus, by proxy, the Sadducean party. Simply put, if there was no temple, there was no Sadducee. So really, this is job security for them, and they took it very, very seriously. The Messianic expectations of the time proclaimed a Messiah who would rule from the temple and usher in a golden age for Israel. The Sadducean conspiracy against the Jewish believers was about power and control. Not only about quelling riots, maintaining the status quo, but also preservation of self. It was driven by selfishness and pride and job security. The period following the martyrdom of Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, which was in between 62 and 70, saw even greater suspicion placed upon the community, especially as tensions between Jews and Romans grew. As the Zealot party grew in prominence and power, they looked everywhere for loyalty and distrusted and even killed those who were seen as traitors. War was coming, and it finally began in Caesarea in 66. Religious tensions had been building between Greeks and Jews for some time, actually, for several years. Also, Roman taxation had completely impoverished the land. When you go and you study the history, that the taxation of the land had totally decimated the culture in Israel. Those who would be considered the middle class were completely impoverished. Okay? War begins when some Greeks sacrificed birds in front of the local synagogue in Caesarea. And this was really the spark that started the fire, which began the First Jewish War, 63 through 70, 66 through 73. Spread very, very quickly to the region. Rome quickly dispatched Vespasian, and his son Titus to quell the uprising. 68. All Jewish leadership and rebels retreat to Jerusalem as they vie for power. A brutal civil war takes out again when you look at the history of what took place in Jerusalem. Because mind you, Rome came in and pushed all the rebels, all those who were fighting for that kingdom of Israel to be restored, all of them are pushed into Jerusalem. And a terrible civil war breaks out in the midst of Jerusalem. Vespasian returns to Rome after Nero dies and leaves Jerusalem to his son Titus. Meaning, leaving Jerusalem to Titus to deal with. Okay? Because they were dealing with it together. And of course, in mid-69, Vespasian is crowned emperor. Now, going back to mid-68 CE, when Vespasian returns to Rome, Titus pulls his troops back for a season. Okay? And this is what happens during that time. The walls of Jerusalem are breached, the city is ransacked, and the temple destroyed. Excuse me, I'm going back here. And that was in 70. So as Titus pulls his troops back for a season, what happens to Yeshua's disciples? They remember Yeshua's words. They're reminded of a prophecy, according to tradition, by an angel. They're reminded of Yeshua's words and seeing the armies, the surrounding armies, the believing community, use the transition in power as an opportunity to escape the city. And this is where one of the major rifts begins between the believing Jews who believe in Yeshua and the remainder of the traditional Jewish community who didn't see Yeshua as the Messiah. This was one more element that created the schism. This action labeled the believers as traitors in the eyes of many Jews in Jerusalem. see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave. And those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. For when the city was about to be captured and sacked by the Romans, all the disciples were warned beforehand by an angel to remove from the city, doomed as it was to utter destruction. On migrating from it, they settled in Pella, the town already indicated, across the Ardennes. These are some of the extra-biblical historical texts that discuss the fleeing of Yeshua's disciples during that season. But the people of the community in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation vouchsafed to approved men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Pelia, which was a Transjordanian realm called Pella. The destruction of the city and the temple changed the entire landscape of the Jewish people and the Jewish religious expression. As we just saw, the believing community escaped and was preserved. And as the years went on, many returned to the region surrounding Jerusalem after the destruction. Shortly after the 70 CE destruction, the Romans destroyed Qumran, which was the study center of the Essenes, located in the Dead Sea in the Negev desert, and the Essenes never recovered. They disappear from history. Okay? Who else disappears at the end of the 70 CE ransacking of Jerusalem? The Sadducees disappear because the temple's now gone. The Sadducees, in all of their pomp and circumstance, and all of their false notions and beliefs, and all their pride and arrogance, and aligning themselves with Rome, they fall. The Essenes disappear off the scene. The Sadducees disappear off the scene. Okay?
Didn't a lot of people run to the temple for protection, and then it was destroyed?
It
So all
was.
those who ran for their safety were destroyed.
Yeah. It is an incredible history in a season. It's so yes, you're right. Thank you, Jenny. There's another major escape of note. You remember who was in charge of the revolt in Jerusalem? The revolt was led by those who were considered zealots of the time. Okay, and they were very tenacious and very brutal at times, and they were very much the ones that saw the remnant of believing Jews who left in mid-68 as traitors. Okay, they felt themselves responsible for the preservation of God's people. Okay, now as the Jerusalem was destroyed in 70, the majority of the zealots were killed as well. But there was a subset called the Sicarii or Sicarii. I don't know exactly how you say it, but they were the ones who carried knives. They were sort of the dagger men, so to speak. They were a splinter group of zealots. They escaped, and where did they find refuge historically? You remember Masada?
Masada, yeah.
Okay, some 930 of these Sicarii and their wives and children. They, after the destruction of Jerusalem, they made their way to Masada in the middle of the Negev desert, very close to the Dead Sea.